All right, we do have David available on the New York Stock Exchange now, so let's go out to David. David, markets closing in bear market territory, that bull run, 11 years in a day. Tell us what's going on down there.
Yeah, so it was a crazy day, made a crazier afternoon here as the day wore on. You had that moment when the head of the World Health Organization said this was a pandemic, not an epidemic, and that's something investors took notice of. As I'm sure you've mentioned here during the course of the show, you have the president now meeting with bank executives. They going around the tables we so often see when the president has these meetings, offering their assessment of how things stand when it comes to the U.S. and the global economy. But it really was that comment where we saw that turn take place, when you had the head of the World Health Organization making that reassessment of what this is, that raised the level of anxiety that we've seen sort of pervading not just the economy, but everyone worried about what's going to happen here with the course of this epidemic. So there's that. There was a kind of seismic note as well to get kind of in the weeds here. Goldman Sachs out with a note this morning talking about that long bull market you mentioned just a moment ago, indicating that from their perspective they see the end of it coming here. So a confluence of factors, that coupled with what we've seen in the oil market over these last couple of days, giving investors a lot of pause. Allison?
David, the typical sectors that you would expect in trouble today, I'm guessing airline, travel-related stocks. Anything unusual going on there in the markets?
I don't think so. When you look at the S&P on a sector-by-sector basis, all of those sectors down today. I mean, you had Boeing coming out talking about cancellations of orders today. Yesterday, you had Continental, a big energy company, saying that it was going to cut its dividend. So again, mentioning the oil market, this is something that's kind of been a bit of a sideshow here to most people, certainly not to investors. But there has been this price war taking place between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Looking at that in context with what's happening here in the United States, that's something that's incredibly worrying to investors here in the U.S.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.